audience gets to find out what they'd like to know.
Okay.
Ask questions.
Can I sit here
Yes.
for the question part, for the question portion?
Yes.
See, I'm a goody two shoes. I don't want to break any rules. Number 2 pencil.
So remember, the Poetry Corner is a place of learning and understanding, so please ask questions so you can find out what you want to know.
Yeah.
Can I get your email?
Yeah. Dang. That's an easy one. Yes. Absolutely. I'd love your email. I'd love your email too. I love, yes. Sure.
When did you graduate from Michener Center?
In 2004.
Do you have any words about it?
Are you at the Michener Center right now?
I'm
Aspiring to be at the Michener
Yeah.
Center? The Michener Center is a great place. It's a great place. Anyone who gets into the Michener Center would be a fool not to go there. It's a wonderful opportunity. You don't get any teaching experience, but I think that if you're an adequate teacher, you get that experience afterward. If you want to be a teacher, it's a great place because you get to learn with visiting writers who come and go. So you work with a lot of different types of people, and you study different disciplines. You have to study at least 2. I studied 3 when I was there. And
What was the third
well,
one?
I was a poet, and my secondary was playwriting, but I actually took more fiction classes than I did playwriting classes. It's an excellent program. It's wonderful. Yeah.
So, as also a goody two-shoes, I had a question. How do you approach subjects that you think are taboo? How do you access those?
I really feel like, honestly, that if you consider a subject matter taboo, you start wrestling with it, and then you're like struggling against, like, it sometimes seems really like, to me, like you shouldn't put anything on the won't write about it list, because once you do that, or at least if you're like borderline obsessive compulsive like me, then you begin, or if you're like a self-sabotager, you just like, then you end up writing about that anyway, I think sometimes the things that we feel like we shouldn't write about or we shouldn't do are the exact things, not always, but I think sometimes those are the exact things we have to do, And I think also just approaching something like, I think one of the things that is really valuable you learn in school, hopefully if you're lucky, you do learn this if you study with someone like Naomi Shihab-Nye, who studied with William Stafford, who said, wake up every morning and write. And most of what you're going to write is going to go onto the compost pile. And some things might turn into something else, but you don't have to show it to anyone. I do really think that you just have to, if you're resisting something, or if you're saying to yourself, I shouldn't write that, or I'm going to make someone angry if I write that, just write it. This is another great thing that I gave this quote to my husband, or I had it on my wall, and he very annoyingly quotes it to me all the time, because this is my problem, is that I've already forecasted every problem that I will encounter from here until the end of whatever, like my life, Emerson said, don't be stopped by obstacles you haven't met, Move steadily forward and don't be stopped by obstacles you haven't met. So, right, if you're stopping yourself by saying, well, when this essay about my mom is published in the New Yorker, she's going to be so pissed off, I'm not even going to write it, You have to just write it. No, and I think the more you write and the more you gain that practice of realizing that not everything you write is going to be interesting, good, worthwhile of anybody else's eyes being upon it, the better you become. Yeah?
I have a follow-up to that. Does finishing the same thing as public? Have you ever finished a poem and felt like this is complete and whole and as good as it's going to be, but nobody ever needs to see it?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there are also just poems that reveal themselves early, or reveal themselves to not be. I mean, it's not like I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm like prints and I have like the vault. I'm going to release those awesome poems that are finished but I've never shown anyone. But I don't think that it's like because I don't want, I think they just haven't, it can be complete and not good, right? Mm-hmm.
I have two questions. One, I just didn't catch the name of the poet that you mentioned earlier.
The Brazilian poet?
No, the one
Laura
that you
Kosicki?
said is also like does YA.
Yeah, her name is Laura Kosicki, and I think you spell it, if I can spell it out loud.
Just go on the internet.
K-A-S-I-S, right.
Yeah,
The internet was
oh,
invented
okay.
since I started reading her.
I'll figure it
K-A-S-I-S-C-H-K-E,
Okay,
Kosicki.
Laura.
Seems right.
out. Okay.
Yeah.
And then also I just really like to hear about how writers, like how do you work? Do you set aside a specific time amount each day? Do you write when it comes to you? How do you
Well, I do set aside a time every day, and then I never write at that time. Because whatever, you know. I do try to write every day. So Laura Kosicki, she was at the Michener Center a few years ago and talked about writing. Someone had asked her, I think in the Q&A, about writing poetry and writing novels, and she said something like, you know, I write poetry in the morning because I need my mind to be really like fertile and strong for poetry writing because it's more difficult. And, you know, after work and after I put my kid to bed, I mean, her kid is grown, but, you know, at night, when like during the time when the rest of us are watching Netflix and doing stuff like that, she's like, yeah, that's when I start working on my novels, because it doesn't take as much brain capacity. I was just like, oh my God, I'm such a failure, you know? She's like writing a novel while she's watching, you know, like Scandal or something. It's like, she's amazing. I don't think that's what she's saying. I think she's saying like I think she's basically saying that she works really, 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 really hard. But I haven't been able to, in the last few months, maintain. I used to try to write a poem a day just to kind of keep like a crappy poem every day. Sometimes just a line or something, just to get that practice and keep that practice up. And, you know, and it comes and goes. And so in the last couple months, I've just been really focused on this novel rewrite, and I haven't been practicing poetry. But I have to go back to it because I'm losing my mind without it, you know? I mean, I'm just like losing the feeling of being like who I am, you know, like being whole without it. Yeah.
What do you mean, like, one line? What would qualify as a line of poetry rather than a thought?
Oh, just whatever, like a thought, I guess. I call it a line to make it sound more important. A thought.
And then, like, do you ever, like, try to delineate between when you're just rewriting and when it becomes poetry?
Well, I think when I'm writing poetry, I'm writing poetry. I mean, I think I do free writing, and like, you know, if I'm like lying awake feeling anxious about, I mean, like free writing is like, you mean like writing in a journal or something?
I mean, like, it doesn't have to do with necessarily meter or anything when you're deciding to publish.
Well, none of my poems have to do with meter, which I've been reminded time and time again by people who care a lot about meter. No, I don't do a lot of free writing. I don't honestly do a lot of sort of like generative writing. I don't have a lot of time to do it, you know? I mean, right now I've been working on a novel which feels like free writing to hell right now. I mean, I'm free writing my brain off and can't seem to get anywhere. But yeah. Yeah.
To what extent does rule breaking affect or not affect your process?
I feel like I call myself a goody two shoes, but I don't. Do you think I'm a goody two shoes, Kirk? Rule breaking. I don't think I've ever honestly set out to break a rule.
Wait, can we define rules? Like, what do you mean by rule breaking?
Well, you know, it seemed like you had it as a concern a lot during your talk earlier. So I was just curious to see if that was sort of an undercurrent that you think about while you write. And I guess more particularly, I'm thinking about structure, sort of like what you were referring to.
Oh, yeah.
Meter, feeling like the poem should sound a certain way,
Yeah.
whereas like maybe you started it and it didn't have that, but you felt like you had guilt to sort of push it in that direction.
I think that one of the things that I feel very proud of as a writer and as a person who reads and consumes not just literature but culture as well, is that I have really tried in the last, 10 years of my life I don't feel a lot of guilt. Like I don't really, the graduate school experience for me, I came from a very small town, not a lot of, I came from a small town with not a lot of experience in literature, and I felt like I was catching up, and I had to catch up, and that everybody was, like the whole imposter syndrome. Everybody was smarter, and there were plenty of people around as well who would be happy to remind others of that, right? And those tended to be male colleagues, students, and male professors, honestly. And in my own experience. And so I feel like since I graduated, I think I faced certain points in graduate school where I would go home from a workshop and say to myself, you can always just go home. Like either you gotta figure out a way of dealing with this, or you've gotta just go home. Because this is like, I'm not gonna deal with this amount of this feeling. Like I'm not gonna have this feeling on me. This feeling of like, I remember being in workshops where people were saying, actually honestly saying in the workshop, somebody speaking on behalf of another poet who is in the room, another poet's work, saying, speaking about it very eloquently. The person who was speaking about it is actually still in Austin as well, Abe Louise Young, who I went to graduate school with, and she was like a beacon in those workshops because she was a totally freaking awakened feminist, and she was not scared to use her voice in class, as I was. I was very scared to use my voice in class. And I remember her defending this poem, and then somebody else saying, I think, and as a rebuttal, one line saying, I think you're giving the intelligence of the poet, I think you're giving the poet too much credit in terms of intelligence. And that being said in a workshop, and like the workshop leader sort of allowing that to happen. And so I feel like after graduate school, I really felt like I want to find my own way here, and I want to surround myself with voices who are trying to find the same way. And I feel like in recent years I have been able to experience not just like a much deeper appreciation of literature, of reading and experiencing other voices, but also just like the culture. Like, I'm not going to feel guilty I freaking adore, I think Parks and Rec is like the best show ever made. I watched it like in its entirety. I think it's some of the greatest writing. It's so funny. The actors, like someone like Chris Pratt is so divine in his talent. Like he has a talent and he has made it into a craft and he practices it, and it's brilliant. And so I just feel like more and more my objective in life is to feel less and less like I need to be doing something that I'm not doing, And I also feel like having children, I want to model that too especially for my daughter, that sort of attitude. No guilt.
Is there a poem that you want to write, wish you could write, but you haven't
Yes.
figured out how to do it?
Yes. I mean, all of them. You mean like on a certain, no, I don't know what's next. I don't know what's next. I feel like that about, I think that trying to learn the craft of writing fiction, that I feel like I know it so little now that I feel like, oh, there's a great story there, but I don't know how to tell it. Like I can see that in fiction. But in poetry, I think that my feeling too is just like, I get really anxious when I feel like I have to do something. My brain is the kind of brain that says if you have to do, that it rebels. It rebels against like really strong imperatives. And that's when I start wasting a lot of time. And I mean, I feel like writing this novel that there have come points, and I've just reached one where I have written it to the point where, it's just like you write to the point where you don't know how to solve the next problem. Like I don't know how to solve the next problem narratively. I don't know how to resolve this. Like in terms of writing, like I don't know, I'm not good enough yet. I've gotten to this point, and now I have to wait for my brain to figure out how I do it next. And then, my own personal like equilibrium, like my feeling is I'm a very conflict averse person. Well, not really. I actually got in a screaming, cussing fight with a guy on the street the other day, and I felt so good about it. I used the F word. I was right in front of St. Edward's, standing in front of St. Edward's, and yelled at, this guy was yelling at me. He started it, he was yelling at me. And then I yelled back
Is
at
it
him.
about parking?
No, I was waiting for the crosswalk, and he was waiting for the bus on the other side of the street. And I was waiting, like a good girl. I was waiting, like there was no cars coming, but I was still waiting for the little white hand to show up. And he was just, I was listening to Hamilton in my earbuds, so I didn't hear him at first. But then I realized, so I wasn't even paying attention to him, so which I think even more infuriated him. And when I finally caught his eye, he was like, why don't you fucking just cross the road? And so I just yelled back, what the fuck does the matter to you, sir? And like that's right when the light came on, I moseyed along. He got on the bus. I was like, God, I hope he gets on the bus before I've crossed. I was like walking back slowly. We're gonna have to work this out. Unless he gets on the bus, we're gonna have to work it out face to face. But you know, just sort of that feeling of so I don't like conflict. I don't like people to have bad times. I want people to have good times, and I want people to you know, poetry is all about that for me. Like poetry is all about sort of like the higher understanding, even if it's difficult. Like that's why I seek poetry as a reader. So you know, right now it's like all the shit is supposed to hit the fan in this novel right now. Like in every novel, like the shit has to hit the fan, or it's really boring, and especially a YA novel. And I'm just like, oh God, I don't want it to happen. I don't want that guy to be a bad guy, and I don't want them to fight and break up. They're gonna break up, or you know, it's like, oh, this has to happen. And so I'm just like twiddling my thumbs, like trying to figure out a way of like writing a novel where, I mean, I just have to do it. I just have to do it. You just have to make. And Jim Magnuson, who runs the Michener Center for Writers. His great advice about writing a novel is make it worse for the characters. Make it worse. And he read this novel. He read the first draft of this novel. And he just said, you know, you got to make it worse for these characters. It's just it's got to be worse for them. So I'm trying to make it worse. Yeah.
So I just had this thought of Stranger Than Fiction, and it had to do with my question in that when you reach conflict in your writing, or you have a hurdle, right? Have you learned do you have like a toolbox, or do you have certain tactics that you've used, you know, time and time again to get over that hurdle so you don't end up like that one author in Stranger Than Fiction who's been writing her last novel
For like this last 16 years?
Yeah.
No. I mean, I just don't know the craft well enough. I think so. I think I have some ways of doing it. One of the things that's really hard is that I do think that part of it is just like stepping back and like going for a walk, or you know, going and listening to some music and like letting it happen in your mind with, you know, like not forcing it to happen. And that's really hard for me. Like that, you know, that sort of waiting for something to happen is really hard, because I have this sort of like, I pride myself on a work ethic. I feel like I try to work really hard. And when that's not the best way to approach something, that's really hard. And then of course it's like a slippery slope, because then like, oh, 5 days have passed now and the house is really clean, but I still have not figured out how to resolve the problem. But you know, I've been like mapping things out a little bit more than, and that's helped. Just sort of going like, okay, this is all I have to focus on. Like this is the scene. You know, if I can get through this, then I can just do this, and you know. And I also think that like when you really do have a sense of when things are happening in a novel, that like theoretically I feel like I could skip ahead and write a scene that happens after, and feel kind of like that would work. And I don't think I would ever do that, because I'm not a good enough writer at this point to do it. But having that sense of like, okay, I know what's coming next is comforting, you know, because it makes it smaller. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned like Shel Silverstein, and then you described one of your poems as like a YA poem. Have you ever thought of that, like, or have you ever sat out to write like a YA poem or a book of YA poems? Or
no, but that would be a great idea,
children's
wouldn't
poems?
it?
Have you ever, or is that of any interest, or what? Yeah.
No.
You mentioned Naomi, she's written a lot of
Yeah.
books for children and stuff, so I didn't know.
Yeah. I've written some children's book manuscripts as well.
Yeah.
I would love to do that. I would love that. I think my perfect, like if I could have a perfect career, it would be like writing kids' books, YA novels, and poetry.
Thanks.
One more?
Okay, one more.
Say something about what you learned from Marie Howe.
Yeah, she had some really great things. She had a couple, Marie Howe, the poet who I studied with at the Michener Center. You know, she always would say, you know, we're here, I don't care who in this class. It was really great, because you also remember, like, these are the stories that I was telling you about, like, so here's Marie, she comes in, and she's like, she says on the first day of workshop, I don't care who's the smartest person in this class. It's of no interest to me. We're here to write poems that break each other's hearts open. You know, I want your poem to break open the frozen lake inside my inside my chest. That is that a Nietzsche thing or Kafka thing? Kafka. And she was so so great at keeping things at that level, which is like the boiling point level. You know, it's like, so all of the people in the class who were like had just been coasting through graduate school on their intellect were like, what? You know? But she was so great. One of the things that she was really good at doing was detecting at the end of a poem, when she used to say, you're just going out on the violins. You know, like there's this big swell at the end of like, oh, like this is the end of my poem, and in case you didn't get the emotions that I had been writing about, here they are again in a recap summary form. So she would always, you know, she was really great at like, the poem really ends here, you know? And I mean, I think I also learned a lot from her poems, like reading her work. She is she's a genius person. She's a genius person, I think. She's someone who I'd like to sort of like listen to how her brain works. She was very honest as well. She was a really honest person. And she was just someone who could just get at the heart of things. She was so deeply uninterested with anything that didn't have to do with that task of a poem being a force, like a force of change, you know, of that breaking open. That I loved it. I love that. That's exactly I think the kind of thing that only a few poetry teachers have, you know. So when I was done with my manuscript, my thesis advisor also left in the middle of my, when I was working on my thesis, he like left. He got another job and he left. And she took his place. Out of the kindness of her heart too. That was not like part of her, she did not have to do that. And I remember she was like, you know, she had to read the manuscript, right? So I had to take it to her. I took it to her. She said, bring it over to my house. And so I like terrified, like went to her house. And, you know, I just sort of, like, you know, I was so expecting this sort of like, you know, hallowed, like this experience of, and so she like her daughter was watching Care Bears. She was making dinner. And I was like, oh, she's a single mom. Like Marie Howe, genius poet, is also a single mom making hamburger for her daughter who's watching the Care Bears. She's a real person, you know, which is like, those are the experiences you want to have as a student in graduate school. Like, if nothing else, if you can just learn that those people are real people with real lives and not, you know, ideas, you know. And so I sat and she said, go sit and watch Care Bears take care of Ynon, basically. And then she also made me go to Kinko's and make copies for her next class the next day. I would have done anything. I really do think at that point, I would have done anything. She could have been like, now you're gonna shave my legs. Let's go. And she sat in her kitchen while she was cooking hamburgers for Ynon, and with a green crayon, one of Yonon's green crayons, went through my manuscript. She read the whole thing there at that moment. And she just went through and X'd out parts and check marked other parts. And then she asked me a couple of like gigantic questions at the end, like, what is the thing that you keep writing about that you're not writing about here? Did someone die or something? I don't get it. And it was a part of my first book that is no longer, it was like a core part of my book that is my first book that is not even, it got washed out of the book. I sort of explained it to her, and she said, yeah, you either need to like actually say it and write those poems, because you're not writing them, they're all those poems that are, they're just like, they're spinning off. Either you need to write about them or you need to sort of get rid of that, which was like super valuable to hear. But it was so like, I went back to that crayon. And you can't write a lot with a crayon. I don't think she wrote any words in the book. And I went back to that more than I went back to any other notes that I received on the book. I mean, in years to come as I was finishing it. She's a genius person. She's also tremendously funny. She's a funny person. And Kirk and I drove her car after after we graduated, but she came back again to teach. And she and her daughter flew back, and Kirk and I drove her car from Austin to New York City. And so we drove through the country, but then we also had to drive into New York City. So she lives on Bleecker Street. Does she live on Bleecker Street?
Yeah, I thought it was a little farther down.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
West of the thing.
It was really cool.
We weren't good.
Derek Walcott lives in her building, Walshawn. And so is that about it? Yeah, okay.
But thank you so much,
Well, thank
Carrie.
you.
and
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Malvern. Thanks for coming out.